Hey guys, Marty here. As I mentioned in my last show, we're going to be looking for the little one, and I do believe that it did come after we had this big swarm right here. We had the little one happened over here. The 2.9 in Willows, California didn't quite make it all the way to Oroville, but then a bunch of stuff started cracking off over in Japan, and the whole east coast there of Japan just started getting completely out of control. And then I saw this, and I was just completely blown away. Check this out.
Seattle, we have a huge earthquake going on. The tower is collapsing.
The Earth shook on a February morning in 2001. It was a nerve-wracking reminder of the constant threat beneath us.
Still going? Yeah.
But small in comparison to the massive quake expected to hit the Pacific Northwest. One that would be stronger than the catastrophic earthquake and tsunami, which killed thousands in Japan.
The chances are that you'll survive it. The challenge is surviving the aftermath.
This is a King 5 special report, Earthquake, Disaster Foretold. Here's your host, King 5 reporter, Glenn Farley.
It happened virtually below where I'm standing, 32 miles underground, out beyond where the Nisqually River flows into Puget Sound. This was the site of Washington's last major earthquake. But don't be confused, this was not the big one. And these smaller earthquakes like Nisqually are connected geologically to the big one that's coming. Because here in Washington, we live in a place where two big pieces of the Earth's crust are being compressed together in slow motion. And I will take you to places where you will see evidence of past big ones. And just like these smaller earthquakes, it's a cycle that keeps repeating itself. If silence could speak. In this coastal forest in Washington state, there is a story to tell. And this place has a name, the Ghost Forest. And the piece here today masks the violence which struck here at 9 p.m. on January 26th of the year 1700. As the geological forces which created a great earthquake and tsunami in Japan just 8 years ago reminds us that even today, that threat remains to strike us on the west coast of the U.S. again. Jeff Oxos takes us up the Copalis River, not far from where it empties into the Pacific Ocean, where the roots of those trees extend, on land that is being pushed higher by tectonic force. So what killed the Ghost Forest? It's very simple, a loss of elevation. So for hundreds of years, these trees were growing in largely a freshwater environment, but they weren't very high above sea level. So in the earthquake, the west coast of Washington state dropped more than 6 feet. This became a salt marsh, and the trees died. From the Copalis River on Washington's west coast to Discovery Bay on the state's north coast, where geography captures wave energy. Geologists can track the history of great earthquakes and tsunamis. Chopping away at a mud bank, Carrie Garrison-Laney exposes the signatures from the past.
This is an event. This is an unusual event.
She's a geologist with Washington Sea Grant, working with the University of Washington.
And there's another sand layer comparable in size to the one above it.
What is gray is what stands out.
Here, there's definitely organic material, but there's also a lot of mud and silt.
Sand pushed in by large waves, covered up by more mud.
This one has a radiocarbon date of about 600 years old. And this one has a radiocarbon date that suggests it's from 1700.
And it's all generated from a 600-mile-long fault running off the Pacific coast, from Cape Mendocino, California, past Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, Canada. The fault runs along a boundary of crustal plates making up the ocean floor that are for now locked to the western edge of the North American plate. Those plates pushing against each other, driving to the northeast and up. And when they release, all hell breaks loose. The next one likely to rank as one of the world's biggest earthquakes, a magnitude 9 plus. Our earthquake history runs deep, and as Garrison Laney goes back further in time taking core samples, you can see the pattern continue.
Marsh, big disturbance event. Normal marsh, disturbance event. Normal marsh, another disturbance event. There's actually 9 or 10 layers.
It's a record dating back nearly 2,000 years. It all promises there will be more violence to disrupt the peace, more ghost forest. A warning for all of us to prepare. Washington has 157 miles of marine shoreline considered vulnerable to tsunami. When we think of tsunamis, we used to think of the outer coast or the Strait of Juan de Fuca, but now we're learning we're also vulnerable here in Puget Sound. So what changed? Well, some of the science has changed. We've made new discoveries. We've also done more analysis on the earthquakes and the waves they generate.
In the Pacific Northwest, a slow-motion collision of tectonic plates along the Cascadia subduction zone has been building tension for over 320 years. And when that tension is released, the resulting earthquake is likely to be as large as a magnitude 9. That will be 45 times more powerful than California's most destructive quake in 1906, and the consequences defy imagination. This megathrust earthquake is predicted to be so significant, locals simply call it the Big One. And scientists estimate that it has an alarming 37% chance of occurring within the next 50 years. In this episode, we'll learn just how this megaquake will impact our cities and find out what's being done to prepare our infrastructure and learn some invaluable lessons about how to make a plan for when the big one hits. Subduction zone earthquakes often cause sudden movement and changes on the ocean floor, triggering tsunamis large enough to completely wipe coastal communities off the map. Remember the Fukushima power plant disaster? In 2011, Japan was hit by a magnitude 9 earthquake, similar to what we're anticipating here on the West Coast, and it unleashed a tsunami of devastating proportions. Chris Goldfinger is a geologist in Oregon who studies earthquakes, and he happened to be in Japan when the quake hit. I asked him to tell me about his experience.
We went outside and just watched the buildings moving, flagpoles whipping, and it just felt like the whole earth had turned to liquid, and yet you could feel this grinding plate underneath us. And as we watched it, though, we knew that Northeast Japan wasn't expected to have anything bigger than about an 8.4. But when it hit 3 minutes and went past 3 minutes, we knew that was wrong. We were going, this is a 9. It has to be a 9. That's what it takes, 3 minutes.
Because of a long history of earthquakes, Japan was so well prepared that this megaquake destroyed a relatively small number of buildings. But they just didn't expect the size of the tsunami that followed. Allison Perch, an engineer from Oregon, visited in the aftermath.
It toppled most of their tsunami walls, inundated huge amounts of the Japan coastline. It killed 16,000 people. And we were there 6 to 8 weeks after the tsunami, going and standing there and smelling the fish smell. And you can imagine where the water went because you can see the water lines on the trees on the hills around it. You can see the pieces of people's lives strewn around. So as an Oregonian, that's really hard, knowing that that's what our coastline's going to look like.
And while the Tohoku quake in Japan was the costliest natural disaster in the world's history, here on the West Coast of the United States, we're nowhere near as prepared as Japan was for this kind of disaster.
If that had been Cascadia and I'd been at work, my building would have collapsed. There's no question about it. I might have gotten out, I might not, but it would be gone. Everybody thought Cascadia was aseismic, meaning no earthquakes, because historically that's what it was. It was dead silent. And then the first evidence was discovered in the early to mid-'80s, and realized that we just happened to be sitting in a quiet spot.
The Cascadia subduction zone is a 600-mile fault that runs from Northern California up to British Columbia. Over the last 10,000 years, geologic records show that there have been 41 subduction quakes here, which averages out to about one every 250 years. The last one came in the year 1700. That's 321 years ago. Since then, tension along the subduction zone has been slowly building as the Juan de Fuca plate steadily pushes into and under the North American plate. The plate edge continues to gradually bend and buckle, and one day it'll release that tension, causing up to 5 minutes of violent shaking and triggering an immense tsunami that could reach 100 feet in some areas.
If you were looking at a bird's eye view of Portland or Seattle, very soon after shaking started, bridges and other longer infrastructure are going to be warping and falling off their foundations. You would see unreinforced masonry buildings start to collapse. This is where 95% of Oregon and Southwest Washington's fuel is brought in and stored. These tanks will deform, they'll spill. Any type of spark or metal hitting each other could also start a fire. The Cascadia subduction zone earthquake is going to be one of the worst disasters America has ever seen.
Officials in Portland, Oregon created this animation showing what they predict one of the busiest bridges in the Northwest will look like. And it's not pretty. In the aftermath of the quake, survivors along the coastline in towns like Seaside, Oregon will have as little as 20 minutes to evacuate before the massive tsunami hits. Mark Ginsburg is a Portland NET, or Neighborhood Emergency Team leader, and has been preparing for the big one for over a decade. Despite living and breathing disaster preparedness, Mark surprisingly doesn't seem too overwhelmed by the inevitable earthquake.
It's not the thing that keeps me up at night. Because I know that I can't control it. I understand where I live, and I understand that that's a possible risk. But I also know that if I do some preparedness work and if I do trainings, this year I redid my first aid and AED trainings, those are the parts that I can do and that I can control. There's your house and the physical things, there's the knowledge, and there's a plan. But I think having the things that you as a family or a household need to just be independent for a little while is really crucial.
Here are Mark's top 5 most important things to keep in your home or garage when preparing for the big one.
Shelf-stable food, water, 1 gallon per person per day. Good fire extinguishers, more the merrier. 2-bucket toilet. Toilet seat, clips on the bucket. Toilet paper, sawdust for your poop. 4-in-1 gas shutoff tool. Thank you. Water shutoff on the bottom, gas shutoff on top. If you turn off your gas, you leave it off and let the pros turn it back on.
Shutting off your gas can be crucial to stopping fires. If you smell gas in your home after an earthquake, Mark suggests grabbing your 4-in-1 tool and simply turning the valve to the off position. It's easy to feel discouraged or overwhelmed when thinking about preparing for a disaster as large as the big one. But I think we could all take a page out of Mark's book.
The time to figure out what to do is not after the earthquake, the flood, the fire, but to know in advance if those things happen, what should we do?
You don't have to join a local emergency team, although it's great if you do, but just taking small steps today to start your preparation, like picking up a gallon of water or a few extra cans of soup for your pantry, can go a long way.
People will want to help and will step up to help to the best of their abilities. That's what everything shows will happen and what has happened in the past. And we can expect that's what's going to happen should we need it in Portland.
So that's quite a bit of information there about the Cascadia fault. But what about the San Andreas fault? Because people are always talking about that. So what's up with that?
Thousands of earthquakes are detected every year, with the majority of them ranging in the lower magnitudes. But every so often certain areas get rocked with large earthquakes, causing large amounts of damage to surrounding areas. When these earthquakes hit sensitive spots though, it can create a worrying discussion. The magnitude 6 earthquake that just hit the northern part of California has got people talking.
I felt that one.
As of right now, there's been no reported injuries, and authorities have said there's been little damage to surrounding areas. But scientists have said that this earthquake, along with others that have hit the region, show us that the area is active, and that more bigger earthquakes could be coming in the near future. This news hasn't been welcomed with open arms, especially when you bear in mind that the director of the Southern California Earthquake Center, a man by the name of Thomas Jordan, came forward and made a chilling announcement, and that was that the San Andreas Fault appears to be in bad condition, even describing it as being in a critical state. Not exactly what you want to hear if you're living close to the region. They then detailed that this condition could cause a large earthquake to happen in the near future. This report was created because researchers said that data has shown them that there hasn't been any major stress released in the area. In fact, none have happened since the 1850s, with teams saying that a large event could be happening anytime soon. And this is because both the Pacific and North American tectonic plates are moving faster than usual. This means only one thing, and that's that stresses between the tectonic plates are constantly building up, and at some point that pressure has to be released. Various events have been recorded throughout the area. One of the biggest was measured back in 1906, with data showing us that a 7.8 magnitude earthquake hit the San Francisco Bay Area. As mentioned though, due to earthquakes of this size not hitting the area recently, scientists and researchers have theorized that we're due for one, and that due to the build-up it could be one of the biggest yet. A series of tests were carried out in order to get a better understanding of this monster earthquake that could be hitting the region, and the team estimated that the magnitude of this earthquake would be around 8, although there was an 8 to 10% chance that it would be greater than this. Worryingly, they said this could happen within the next 30 years, and that's because of where it's located. This magnitude 8 earthquake would have over 1,000 times more energy than that of a 7 magnitude earthquake, with them saying that magnitude 7 earthquakes can cause serious damage to nearby areas, so a magnitude 8 earthquake could devastate communities. Although scientists have said that the outcome of this earthquake wouldn't be as bad as the movie, they did say that one worrying thing is that this event is going to happen. There's no way we can stop it. Lives will be lost, and that there will be widespread damage and huge economic impacts around the region, and that a massive rebuild effort will have to take place that will cost billions. The United States Geological Survey went into more detail and said that they wanted to understand the effects a magnitude 7 earthquake would have on this region, saying that they used current events to predict what would happen. They said that with the current build-up, a huge earthquake would tear through the area, and from this model it showed them that hundreds of roads, fiber optics cables and power lines run through this area, and they estimated that the cost of damage to buildings alone would be over 33 billion, and said that billions more damage would happen due to gas leaks and fires. As if this wasn't bad enough, researchers have said it's not just the San Andreas Fault we need to worry about, as various other regions throughout the United States will experience large earthquakes within the next few decades. Austin Elliott, a US Geological Survey research geologist, said the following: "This was a small earthquake along essentially that whole fault system, and that's a very active structure. The region has experienced several magnitude 5 earthquakes over the years, but those who work for the US Geological Survey did say that it's understandable why people would be worried, saying that one of this size is expected to be felt throughout various places across the state." The USGS continued to say that people who live in areas that have soft sediments are more likely to feel the shake of the earthquake, while those living on elevated land won't feel the effects as much. Elliott detailed that during the earthquake he was in San Francisco, and said that he was able to feel a strong shaking, saying that his apartment was shaking a lot, and it even caused him to become dizzy. He continued with the following: "This one, because of its distance, was probably more perceptible in places that really amplified the slow distant waves, and so like the high buildings that I'm in." Keith Knudsen, Deputy Director of the United States Geological Survey's Earthquake Science Center, said the following: "Even though people can't stop earthquakes from happening, they can learn to live with problems caused by earthquakes. 3 major lines of defense against earthquake hazards are being developed. Buildings in earthquake-prone areas should be designed and constructed to resist earthquake shaking. Building codes that require attention to earthquake shaking have been improving in recent decades and constitute a first line of defense. In some cities, programs are underway to strengthen or tear down buildings that will most likely collapse due to earthquakes. A second line of defense involves the selective use of land to minimize the efforts of hazardous ground. High occupancy or critical structures, for example, should not be placed inside the San Andreas Fault. The third line of defense will be the accurate prediction of earthquakes. When such predictions become possible, it will permit timely evacuation of the most hazardous buildings. So, what do you make of the announcement that the San Andreas Fault is about to crack?
Well, I'm not overly surprised by that, and I don't think a lot of people would be. It's just a matter of when, not if, and the same with Cascadia. A lot of people are watching that. There's a lot of other faults in the area that are little sister, little brother to the San Andreas, like the Hayward Fault. A lot of people don't know about that. Check this out.
Most people in the Bay Area know about the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, and they know about the 1906 earthquake and fire. But the 1868 earthquake was so long ago, and so our memory of that has really faded over time.
On the morning of the 21st of October, in the year 1868, happened one of the most terrifying calamities that has ever visited the coast of California. At 7 minutes to 8 o'clock, a violent trembling and shaking of the earth occurred.
They called it the Great San Francisco Earthquake, but it predated the 1906 quake by more than 30 years. The earthquake of 1868 was absolutely devastating.
Let us fervently hope that we have seen and felt the last of this earthquake. Charles E. Miller, October 24th, 1868.
When the shaking stopped, which was estimated at a magnitude 7.0, 30 people were dead and hundreds of buildings were wrecked. The strongest shaking was in the East Bay towns of Hayward, San Leandro, and Fremont. Luckily, these were sparsely populated areas at the time.
In 1868, the entire population of the East Bay was about 24,000 people. About half of those people lived in Oakland. Cities like San Leandro, Hayward had about 500 people. But now, of course, we have over 2.5 million people that live within a stone's throw of the Hayward Fault.
A lesser-known cousin of the San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault is a crack in the Earth's crust up to 20 miles deep that stretches roughly 40 miles from San Pablo Bay in the north to Fremont and Milpitas at its southernmost end.
It is constantly moving, little amounts every year. The problem is it's not moving enough. And so we still have big earthquakes on the Hayward Fault to make up the difference.
The Hayward Fault, like the San Andreas, sits atop the boundaries between the North American and Pacific plates, sheets of the Earth's surface which are constantly grinding past each other. Over time, some underground areas along the fault lock, increasing tension. Eventually, when the stresses become too great, the fault slips, releasing energy in the form of underground seismic waves. Those waves produce the shaking we experience as an earthquake.
I'm walking along the Hayward Fault, and here is the offset caused by the fault on this curb.
Jim Leenkemper is a geophysicist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Menlo Park. His specialty is paleoseismology, which means that he studies ancient earthquake ruptures. Leenkemper and others on the USGS team dig trenches across earthquake faults. Peering into tectonic time, they find evidence of fossil earthquakes which they radiocarbon date to determine the magnitudes and dates.
It's only in this deep trench that we're able to get back older in time. So 2,000 years ago, we're looking right around here at the time of the Romans.
Along the Hayward Fault, we have dug one trench very close to the Fremont BART stop. At that site, we have evidence for 12 earthquakes in a single trench.
most interesting thing we have found is the rate of earthquakes has been fairly regular over the last 2,000 years.
Not only is it regular, it's due. Their data have shown that a major quake on the Hayward Fault has occurred roughly every 140 years for the last 2,000 years. The 140-year deadline came and went in 2008. So now we're officially overdue for another big one. A USGS study in 2015 concluded there is a 72% probability that a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake will occur in the next 30 years on one of the Bay Area's 7 faults. So, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
Probably the most dangerous fault in the United States is the Hayward Fault right here in the Bay Area, and that's because it has the potential for very large earthquakes, and it runs right through a very built-up area.
And when it goes off, the lives of 7 million people who live and work in the Bay Area will change in a matter of seconds.
Roadways will be shut down. The soft, sandy deposits along the margin of the bay where we have airports, approaches to bridges, they're likely to liquefy, ripping apart the roads. So I think we can assume transportation networks will be completely disrupted and destroyed. Water will likely be shut down. There will be fires because gas lines will rupture. There won't be enough water to fight the fires. Power will be down.
And if that's not enough to get your attention, recent findings by the USGS indicate that a rupture on the Hayward Fault could continue on to the Calaveras Fault, which runs east of downtown San Jose.
The maximum earthquake we could have if the entire Hayward Fault ruptured is about magnitude 7.1. But then if you add an earthquake that would continue on to the Calaveras Fault, you could get a substantially larger earthquake, maybe about 7.4, which would have devastating impact across the region.
To put that in perspective, the total economic damage after Hurricane Katrina was about $125 billion. Scientists are projecting more than $170 billion worth of damage from a magnitude 7 event on the Hayward Fault. And after the earth stops shaking, at least 200,000 people will be left homeless.
I often say it'd be a lot like Katrina, but here we'd be speaking 150 languages as well.
Scientists are understanding more and more about the Bay Area's seismic quirks and how to build structures that can cope with them. So for Tom Broker, the next step is getting the word out.
Well, you know, preparing for an earthquake is really everyone's job. We can have a kit so that we can survive for 3 days after an earthquake. Government needs to do their job. They need to be prepared so they can respond to the earthquake. How quickly we recover from the earthquake is really determined by how well we've planned in advance for the earthquake and how well we've prepared for it.
Amen, brother. You said it.
We conducted a field test on a model levee on Sherman Island in the western delta, and we deliberately made that levee really strong because we wanted to study the peat underneath it. And so we shook the levee and then monitored its settlement over time because disturbing the peat with earthquake waves can accelerate settlement of levees.
Okay, guys, that's all I have for you today. God bless and be nice to one another, please.